And we're live. Welcome, everyone, to episode 4 of Closer2Closers. I'm really excited because I'm joined today by a customer of ours and also just someone I've been having a great time hanging out with and chatting with and working with, Henry Bell. Henry is the head of growth at Starbridge. How are you doing today?
Not bad. Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
And thanks so much for joining me, man. I have so many things that I want to talk to you about. There's so much stuff, and I think what's particularly exciting to me is we're both heads of growth at companies that sell to salespeople. So I think we have like a lot in common, and the whole point of this podcast, right, is can I have enough conversations with sales leaders, heads of growth, heads of revenue, as well
Hmm.
as like AEs and SDRs to just understand what it takes to get closer to being a closer, right?
Yep.
And I truly believe it's a full sales org effort to get there, and that's kind of what I wanted to spend most of our time on. But before we get there, what I'd love to do is just have you introduce yourself. Talk to me a little bit about sort of your journey up until right now at Starbridge. How'd you get here, and what's your experience been?
Yeah. Um, so I started in tech a few years ago as a BDR, and it was very much just like super manual. Kind of just like your standard BDR role, where you're given a target accounts list, um, spending a ton of time doing kind of like research, multi-threading, doing that whole thing. Um, I then worked for for the head of growth at Juniper Square, where first started kind of getting introduced to like the notion of finding intent signals at scale, and kind of using those to drive outreach. And so we were like launching a new segment, like targeting a new vertical. Our main vertical was like private real estate managers, and then we wanted to move into like private equity and venture capital. And
Mm-hmm.
a big thing that we wanted to figure out was like when someone was going to raise a fund. And so a lot of it was just trying to figure out like, okay, their past 5 funds, what was kind of like the median timeline in months between them, and then targeting companies that were like 8 months away from raising their funds, or like firms 8 months away. So anyway, that was like an interesting experience where I was like, okay, like there's clearly one way of doing this, which is like super manual and kind of like very tailored, spending a ton of time for a handful of messages every day, versus scraping your entire TAM and then finding kind of like signals at scale and kind of going about it that way.
Right.
Um, so I ended up then moving over to numeric, as the first go-to-market hire, and I was kind of leaning pretty heavily into that idea. And this coincided with like Clay popping off with like more sophisticated email deliverability systems.
Right.
And so that was where it got really into like this like growthy type role,
Mm-hmm.
where I started leaning more into kind of like job changes, job postings, recent news events, like new acquisitions, new product launches, kind of all this stuff that's like becoming more and more the status quo in like growth plays these days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then from there, it was fun to see it scale, and I think that's where I really had conviction that this is kind of like the new way of going about it. Where rewind a few years ago, and it was kind of this predictable revenue model where you hire SDRs and there's kind of like a linear relationship with SDR headcount and pipeline. Whereas there, we didn't hire BDR or SDR until like you know 2 years in, and for the first 2 years, it was just kind of me running the systems and
Wow.
generating like triple digit meetings every month, which was pretty
Damn.
cool. And
And
so
can I ask, like, what when you were doing that, sort of what channels were you leveraging? Was it primarily like email, cold email? Were you layering in like LinkedIn touches? Um,
yeah, I mean it was mainly just email, and I think my take on it is, if you email is like the most saturated channel, but it's also like the marginal cost to like send a new email is so low that that's why it's so saturated. But if you can cut through the noise via email, even if it's just like a few basis points, then you can start to kind of like double down on more like volume constrained channels like LinkedIn DMs or like cold calling, for instance. And so our strategy was, and this was kind of like the impetus behind hiring BDRs, was like test everything at scale via email, then like hire BDRs or virtual BDRs, which are just like LinkedIn avatars that are like subcontractors, and then send LinkedIn DMs at scale to the top 20% of the prospects per campaign, and then have them cold call it to the top 10% per campaign, and have like the messaging be kind of consistent throughout. So that's kind of the point that we got to as I was leaving, where it was like, okay, let's scale in BDRs and kind of layer them into these campaigns. But early on, it was just like straight email, getting like 100-ish meetings every month.
Got it. Yeah, no, clearly a lot of love for you. Got Brianna saying triple digits. Let's go.
But yeah, so anyway, and then I moved over to Starbridge because I feel like, the intent signal approach is so compelling, and I think you could do it. I think it just kind of translates to so many different aspects of like the go-to-market motion, where you can use it to like kind of like outbound. You can use it for like account scoring. So like every month, you want your like top 100 accounts to like maybe invite to a dinner or something like that, or some event. You can do it that way. And so I just think that the idea of taking all publicly available information, translating that into some action, is super compelling, and that's kind of what led to me joining Starbridge.
No, that's really exciting, and I think it's always compelling when you've kind of cut your teeth doing the prospecting like at the BDR level, and then kind of done like a more traditional sort of outbound sales like cadence, and then from there kind of coming into like an intent signal role, right? Like you're kind of steeped in it. You're not like, hey, I sold other things and now I'm doing intent signals. You're like, I've sold before and I know what it's like to sell without intent, and now I'm like, intent product.
Definitely. Right? And I feel like two thoughts about that is, one, I think like if you've been a BDR before, like you kind of know, like, it is like kind of like a waterfall of like what intent signals you care about. And so if you kind of look at an account, you're probably going through and looking at like, okay, number one, were they like at their previous company, were they a customer of ours? Like that's ideal. Or number two, who are they connected with? Can I find like an intro from them? 3, what are like the new recent like news events? 4, fundraising. And then you kind of just keep going down that list. And I think, if it's a little more challenging if you haven't been a BDR and done that manually, to then kind of like find ways to like automate that whole workflow and kind of like, And then the second one is like, it's cool selling to sellers because, if you hire people like or recruit people, like they get it right away. Like you guys, when we onboarded with Glen Coco, like you were like, yeah, this makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. I think obviously I'm sure like most of the audience watching this is like already kind of clued into the intent signal game, but for like maybe the people that are just kind of getting familiar with the concept, I did kind of want to like do a first principles approach, right? And used to be the case that like all of your intent data used to be collected when you were in conversation with your prospect, right? That it was purely like a discovery action that was done synchronously. Like you were in a call, or even like, if you go pre like online sales, right? Like in person, it was everything you were picking up in like a meeting, and then like some sort of like side data. You got like alpha from people, and then you kind of cobbled this all together to come up with a conception of like, hey, is this guy like ready or not ready, etc. Right? It was considered like intel or just like lead intelligence, right? And I feel like a lot of the way we do outbound today is just built on the shoulders of the fact that there was no clear visibility of intent. So volume of outreach just becomes a proxy for that, right? Like in an ideal world, I'd want to talk to like someone who is interested in buying my product or has expressed some sort of interest. And you get that with inbound traffic, just like you'd get that from someone who walks into your brick and mortar establishment, right? Those are intent signals versus like, if I don't have something, it's like a little more esoteric when I'm selling like B2B software, right? I just have my proxies like, okay, I have title, I have like company size, and I'm gonna like just go after this title at this company. I'm gonna touch as many of them as possible, and then some of them hopefully have a timing signal. So for
Yeah.
me, like volume is a proxy for not having visibility into intent and timing, right? And so for you, like, when did you kind of start seeing, I guess, like start seeing like intent becoming less of this sort of manual, like human mind thing, and more operationalized and centralized of like a mining exercise that's done by like a head of growth or like a GTM engineer?
Yeah. I think it's probably two things. I think one is just like the new set of tooling. And so, Clay is very effective at this, Starbridge too, where, uh, you just kind of come up with like a concept where it's like, okay, I want to find any company that, has headcount growth north of 30%, and that has like open JDs for BDRs where, cold calling is a key priority in that. Um, like you could do that manually, kind of searching through, but it's very difficult. And so Clay can kind of give you that list of companies. And then obviously like LLMs make things substantially easier. And I
Yeah.
think, you're taking kind of all of this unstructured data and then kind of converting it into, either like an intent score and or, kind of like an understanding of like what their top pain points are and how that translates into how you can, address those issues. And so I think that from a data collection standpoint, that probably wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. And then from a executional standpoint, it's very difficult to like throttle volume. And in the past, like you basically hired a BDR team and you needed to like steadily, increase your domain reputation so that you could get away with sending, that volume of emails.
Right.
Now like Google is so on it when it comes to like the spam and whatnot, that it is kind of this game of cat and mouse of setting up the deliverability infrastructure and whatnot. And I think that's kind of like the key factor as you kind of centralize it into one person kind of scaling this and doing it
Right.
with pretty high level of volume. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think with the tech change, right? Like with the technology change, it's happened in stages, I feel, right? Like the concept of lead scoring and stuff, that kind of came into prominence. Like in the early 2010s, like that's when people were like really starting to talk about that stuff, like 2012-ish. And from there to like now, it's like lead scoring is kind of table stakes for a lot of organizations. And I think for me, something that always kind of sticks out to me is there's different industries, right? Like, so someone hears this concept of like lead scoring and they're like, oh, everyone should be doing lead scoring and like everyone needs to do it now. And I'm like, look, there's a stage. It depends on sort of your ICP and depends on your size as a company before you sort of layer these things on, right? So I think sometimes people get paralysis, but for me, like the big signals that like I need to be intent reliant is if my pitch is heavily timing reliant, right? So if there's like a massive timing event that happens versus like a persistent problem, and we see this on Glen Coco all the time, right? There's pitches that are like evergreen that can be like delivered at any time because people are always frustrated with their existing 3PLs, or like they're always frustrated with their existing HRS. So it's like a good enough time to pitch if you've got a compelling value proposition versus, you're probably better equipped to speak to like SLED, but it's like some of the stickiest accounts, right? Like when someone's in there, they're locked in for multiple years, et cetera. So you don't want to waste firepower, like talking to someone who has no earthly way of buying your solution today, right?
Yeah.
So like, how do you, like, what for you is like a good rule of thumb if for someone listening to this that, hey man, you should probably look at mining intent signals?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the best practice, I actually saw a LinkedIn post from like, I think it was a CRO at Talk something. Anyway, his whole thing is right when a customer closes, setting up like a 15-20 minute interview. And then, beforehand, like, there's a lot of stuff that's just like pretty static, like the size of the company, like who they're targeting, just kind of like the firmographic stuff. and then there's the like what was actually going on behind the scenes. Like what kind of led to this, what drove the urgency, and then kind of just trying to figure out ways in which you can take those insights and then kind of compile, like a tier one list of companies. And I think a lot of teams, they'll have like these like tier one, tier two, tier three companies, and it's mainly that former category of like, okay, these are just the types of companies that we care about. They have a sales team between 5 and 10 people. They're in software or B2B SaaS, whatever, and then that's it. And then they don't really enrich it. And I think having that next level of kind of detail of, okay, but like month over month, this needs to be happening. And if these things are happening, then that makes them, like an even better fit. And I think that's kind of where these tools come in. Like Bluebirds is one of them. Starbridge for SLED, where it's like, yeah, you just kind of have to know that information. And like it could be, an upcoming fundraise where like they're just like super pressed to hit their targets. It could be, I don't know, like layoffs, and they needed to be more like efficient with like the headcount that they had. It could be a handful of things, but I think getting that kind of qualitative intel and then figuring out what you can get at scale and using that to then tier your accounts on like a monthly basis versus just having this like list that you refer to every now and then.
Right. And so like, I feel like with use cases, there's probably like a spectrum, right? Where I might initially want to mine some like base intent data. So this could be like the simplest, like easy to access stuff, which is like, hey, who's got an open job posting or something that's very easy to get access to, right? That data versus the more esoteric stuff. Again, like I think fundraise, there's now like people that mine that and kind of centralize it. You have your pitch books, you have your Crunchbases and stuff, but then you have sort of niche intent data, right? Where the kind of stuff Starbridge is capturing is just phenomenal on the SLED side. I don't think that kind of visibility has existed, at least not in a way that I've seen on other vendors, right? So what I'd love to understand is if I was trying to do like a first principles intent data practice, and I don't have budget to procure a vendor, right?
Yep.
What is your recommendation for me?
No budget. I mean, no budget makes it a little trickier, I think.
Or rather, let me rephrase the question. Maybe.
Yeah.
I have been given a mandate to build it myself, so I don't have the ability to go out and procure like Starbridge, right? Or like procure like whatever ZoomInfo or Apollo, like any like some of these data providers are trying to kind of edge into the intent signal space, but I don't. Let's say I didn't have that. And I'm like, okay, I can go online, I can find some web scrapers, right? But I got to do it scrappy and myself. What do I do?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good point of like this distinction between these kind of like usage-based tools, like you could find all these like web scrapers and kind of cobble together your own tech stack versus, there's these systems that are trying to be kind of these like fully out of the box tools. And I think, so if I were kind of putting things together, like I would start with, like 10 intent signals that I care about. And so like maybe like job changes, job postings, recent news events, all of that. And yeah, I mean, a lot of that data comes from LinkedIn. And so there's like a handful of tools you can use to like pull LinkedIn data, like Phantom Buster is a good one. And you can you could have that like in one like snowflake table where each column is kind of like a different intent signal with some value attached to it. And then you are using like cobbling together kind of like all these data sources, thinking through like where does this data live? And so a lot of the job related stuff is going to be from LinkedIn. A lot of the news stuff is going to be from like scraping Google News. Fundraising stuff is going to be, buying like a cheap license with Crunchbase. And so that's kind of how I would think about it, where, you go intent signals and then it's like, okay, where do I get that data? And then, okay, piece by piece for each kind of like set of data, you then are just looking online for like one specific tool to then kind of like run at getting that information. Um, I think what's cool about Clay, Starbridge, and then some other tools is that you can kind of like you can do that where that workflow, like Clay is basically like a spreadsheet, and you have any data provider that's available, like Crunchbase, built-in, Google News, all of that lives in that spreadsheet, and you can actually go get that information.
Right.
And it's way more, I think Clay is like a pretty appropriate name where it's like you can like really mold it to exactly your business versus, like a Zoom info where they're kind of just like doing boilerplate intent signals and you don't really have much, you can't customize it as much. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, I think honestly, like today, with tools like Clay and stuff, the access to signals is so high that like today I think someone that's trying to like do an intent data practice, they might be tempted to just jump in and be like, okay, let me just get an intent vendor. And then I'm like just getting pummeled with all of this data. And I feel like they don't go through like the initial exercise of like, hey, how do we define intent? Right?
Yep.
Like, or what do we consider our intent signals? Because intent isn't defined by like the prospect, really. Like it's defined by us.
Yep.
Which is kind of like a weird thing, right? Like it's expressed by the prospect, but it's defined by us, and we codify it in terms of okay, like for Glen Coco, it's like okay, if they're looking to build, if they're looking to build a sales team, if they've had, if so they have open SDR job posts, if they've had like recent turnover on their SDR team, right? If they've had layoffs on their SDR team, like these are all kind of signals for us, right? To come in and be like, okay, it looks like you guys are having volatility with your GTM team. Can we supplement with our marketplace, right?
Totally.
And that's kind of how we've thought of intent, at least. And this is again super surface level, right? There's probably like n levels of deeper, sort of more nuanced data we can collect. But right now we're like, okay, we can operate here, and we're getting bites. And then once we've sort of hit our plateau or hit our wall with this, is when we feel the need to mine deeper. But it's because we sat down and we're like, all right, guys, like, when do people think about getting like, adding on like fractional SDRs or like contractors, et cetera? Like, when does that happen? And I feel like that's like a philosophical exercise and before you get the data. Right? And any tips for how you think, like best practices that you guys tell your customers, for example, at Starbridge, if, hey guys, like we're going to open the floodgates on data for you, but here's how you should think about this.
Yeah. So I actually think one interesting trend too is like, to your point, it's not like each business is different, and like each, like it's basically like what is happening behind the scenes that causes the problem that your product solves, and those causes are going to be very different business by business. And so I think like one trend that I think is going to continue to happen is like there's going to be vertical specific intent signals. And so Clay is very horizontal, where you can kind of like build out these tables that monitor your market, but everyone's kind of dealing with the same data sets. I think with Starbridge, what is pretty unique, and this is kind of like why I joined, is that you can access kind of all of these, the information that Clay provides, but then you also have specific stuff relative to selling into SLED, namely, let's look at like all of this information legally needs to be revealed, but you have to submit FOIA requests to access the information. And so we basically use AI and kind of like, we have like a little secret sauce to access all of that data. And so one super valuable one that's very popular is, you take your top 10 competitors and you look at, you get notified anytime they have a contract expiring in the next 6 months. The reason why that's critical for our buyers in particular, or the people that like work with us in particular, is that like these contracts are so long, like 5 to 10 year contracts. And so more often than not, you'll have these companies that their SDR teams are spending forever getting in front of these companies, which is like a monumental task to begin with. And then they're like, oh yeah, we're in the middle of a 5-year contract, like let's touch base in 2028. And so that specific intel is relevant to people that sell into SLED, and it's data that is like unique. And so I think for us, like when we onboard people, we we kind of have like, a handful of intent signals that we know are going to be valuable for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of it too is, using LLMs to kind of go level deeper. And so, for that specific example, like you can find, over the next 6 months, here are the competitors. You can then find their buyers, and then you can look at kind of these buyers in their board meeting minutes and look for like any mention of their competitor,
Right.
any issues they're having with said competitor. You can also take that keyword of like, let's say 15 keywords relevant to your business, and you can pull any problems that they're having under the umbrella of those keywords.
Yeah, and
And so anyway,
more than that too, right? You're actually even able to tell me like, hey, not only is my competitor with these sled vendors, but here's like the contract value and like the date of expiry of that contract. Like you're able to give me.
yeah.
I wish the deal team had heard of you before they went and sent someone to go work for Rippling. It's like a less risky way to get intent data.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's the play. It's like, you have these, you can just go super deep with that specific intent signal. You can do it with others too, where, a lot of times we'll have customers and they have kind of like these living like dashboards almost, or like they're kind of like living spreadsheets in Starbridge, where you have like one where it's like, okay, I want every mention of chronic absenteeism across like these 20,000 institutions.
Right.
And then they'll get notified like every month, it'll refresh. And then it's like, here are the institutions, here's the snippet. And then here's like an email that you can take kind of from that mention and translate it into, messaging. And so anyway, I think like for us, a lot of it is just kind of, there's a lot of hand holding up front to kind of make sure that we're getting them set up with the relevant intent signals. And then they're off to the races where, they have these kind of living tables. They then feed into like their CRM. And then every week or every month, their reps can go in and be like, okay, you're the top 20 accounts. And we know like X, Y, and Z is happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I almost feel like I feel like when it comes to reps that are in an organization that's like steeped in intent data, I feel like the way you train your reps has to change, right? Or it's gonna, because like the more intent data I get, the less sort of generic my pitch has to be, right?
Yep.
Like if I know it's about chronic absenteeism, that's what I'm going to hinge on, and like the rest of my pitch becomes less important, and that's what I'm going to hone in on. And usually, pre-intent signals, people would kind of come in with like a general sort of deck, demo, and pitch. I would tell you about, sort of give you a broad idea of everything I do, and kind of anchor in on, hey, we solved these 4 problems. And then through talking to you, I'd figure out real time which of your problems is like, which of these problems is most relevant to you. And then I'd kind of like steer the pitch in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because now get all
yeah.
that ahead of time. So how does that change how I train my rep, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think like, the classic advice, and I've been in AE very briefly, and so I'm not going to try and make the argument that I like know what I'm talking about. But I will say like one big takeaway was like discovery is so important. You really want to like nail like one hyper specific problem that they're happening and kind of tailor things around that. I think, I think as you think kind of more about like the growth marketing side where you're targeting these companies, like you can't really get away with just saying here's everything we do. Like here is like we do this, and this. Any interest? One, it's too wordy. Two, it's just like it doesn't really resonate. And so I think the value of these intent signals is you could have something that's like ultra specific that is probably a pain for them given what is happening, and then all the way through the funnel, from them saying yes to a meeting through to that first conversation, like AEs are going to be better prepared for that call because they'll know kind of what to zero in on, and so on. And so I think you just get leverage across the whole funnel if you kind of start with these intent signals. I feel like you've used the word intent signals like 30 times during this call.
We're only halfway through, man. But I think it's also like the other way that it needs to change, in my opinion, is is typically people are like, hey, this is like the pitch, and this is like, the pitch flow, this is the demo flow, and all of this information. And I think even with our callers, right? Like the Starbridge campaign you have on Glen Coco, it's doing well because you're sending us these intent signals, and then we versioned the pitch for like each intent signal. The kind of way callers are opening up the conversation is different, right? And I feel like what it forces callers to do is, and also like not just SDRs but also AEs, is it forces you to have a more like modular, deep understanding of your business, because you can't do like a scripted pitch anymore, right? Because your pitch is going to change literally person to person, right? And so as a result, like you're going to have multiple pitch versions at the very least. And in the best case scenario, your product so well that you're able to kind of come in and have a really organic conversation of like, hey man, I saw you were having this, and now I'm coming in as like a consultant to you, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of going back to the, as you think about these channels, what's cool is you kind of have like the growth person who is kind of coming up with these campaigns, coming up with these intent signals in the messaging, and then also kind of like putting on that RevOps hat too, where you have, let's say you kind of experiment, you have 10 intent-driven campaigns that you want to run. You establish like a baseline conversion rate, which is, if you were to just say, hey, we're Starbridge, we do this, we want to talk, like take that, and then you test these 10 campaigns, and then if like they have, let's say they're north of like a 0.5% conversion rate, then from there, okay, let's double down on this campaign, where we then start to, invest in these channels that are more costly, like cold calling. And so like what's cool about Glen Coco is, you can kind of take like the job changes campaign and be like, all right, here are the top 20% of the prospects. Let's now put together like a script. And you can also put together like little tokens that feed in and that like they can kind of reference that are unique to them. Like their city, maybe their past company, their competitors, a colleague's name, all of these tiny things that like will move the needle when you get connected with them, where you're not sounding like this kind of boilerplate call center. You have like, it sounds like you've done your research and that like you almost earn their attention.
Because like the messaging just becomes so much more relevant and poignant, right? Like I feel less like I'm being sold to when someone gets on a conversation with me and is just like, hey man, like let's talk about your problem. And even though that is that's a sales pitch I love and I'm happy to take because it's oriented to like someone's helping me solve my problem, right? Versus like someone's like, look at this shiny new thing I got. It does 5 things and hopes one of those things appeals to me, right? Like, and it just changes the paradigm. Switching gears slightly, selling to salespeople, easy or hard?
I think, I wouldn't say easy, but I think, my previous company, we were targeting accountants, and accountants are not easy to target. Like, I think like, I've never worked at a company that sells into like engineering teams, but I've heard that's like the hardest. I think what's cool about selling to like go-to-market leaders is that like cold calling is a good example. Like oftentimes they're like, all right, let's see what you got. You know what I mean? Like they kind of recognize how difficult things are, and they're willing to kind of give you the time of day if
there's higher empathy.
There's so much more empathy. The other piece is like the ROI is like infinitely easier when it comes to like these go-to-market tools. Like you can basically say, you ask them like, what is your ACV? And then you say, okay, perfect. Here's how much we cost. If you close like one deal, then it pays for itself. And it's a lot easier from like, a sales cycle timeline. Like our sales cycle is like very, very short and top of funnel. Like you can just like, they'll appreciate kind of like how difficult things are. And if you've demonstrated that like you've done research or have compelling messaging, then they will give you their attention.
Absolutely.
I don't know, I'd be curious about what you think.
I agree. So it's easy to get in front of, but I feel like the scrutiny of the pitch itself, so like the meta level of it, right? because at that point, I feel like you're not only on the hook for your solution, you're also on the hook for the quality of your sales team, right? Like there'll be
Yeah,
like, man, these guys can't even send a follow-up email on time, right? Like,
true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the solution could be like unbelievable, but like, if the amount of scrutiny on your sales process as is, I feel goes up. But I
Yeah,
relish that challenge.
yeah.
And
It does. Yeah, it kind of feels like an interview. Like we were demoing with one sales tool, and our CRO was on the call, and it was just so funny because at the end of it, he was like, "Yeah, you did a good job. Couple, points of feedback. So it was just kind of funny where like you have that unique dynamic."
yeah, and I also, I also think like in selling to sales, like what you said about knowing the like salespeople kind of know their numbers, and I feel like it's also easy outside coming in to look at any sort of head of sales, and you can be reasonably confident that they're dealing with the same math equation problem, like CAC, ACV, right? Like conversion rates, their funnel,
Yep.
right? There's like a pretty well defined set of KPIs, and
Yep.
I feel like before Glen Coco, I used to sell into like the UX vertical and like the UX research vertical primarily, right?
Yep.
And stuff there just became more like esoteric, right? It's about like, oh, can we, like, I'm trying to get this kind of insight about my users, and how do I relate something as qualitative as that to like a KPI? I can be like, hey, we moved this needle for you, right? So the only sort of metric I could rely on was like, hey, time to insight, right? Like there was like, okay, we've reduced your time to insight, and that was somewhat resonant, but
Yep.
it is way most of that pitch was like super qualitative, super dependent on like the end user's needs and like the kinds of research that they did and things like that.
Yep.
And there's obviously like an amount of tailoring that happens when you're selling to any one person's sales motion, but
Yep.
across the board, it's safe to say that whatever the company is, these guys are concerned about bottom line, concerned about revenue, concerned about pipeline, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that makes it like a little bit easier, I think, to sell into than like another ICP.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think too when you get into it seems like once you're stepping further and further away from kind of like the revenue function, it gets into the like save costs or save time component, which one is just way harder to quantify, and then two gets like increasingly generic. Where like I just feel like everyone and their mother when they're selling into like insert like engineering team or HR or whatever, that's kind of their whole angle every single time. Whereas like with selling to these go to market teams, like it is it's more specific and it's substantially like easier to quantify and kind of like prove out the ROI.
Got it. And without naming names, like when you guys see people come to your door, or like people come in, and this is perhaps the most exciting part of this conversation for me, is because you also, like me, have a cross-sectional view of multiple sales teams, multiple sort of, and you're clearly preoccupied with where Starbridge sits in their sales process, but
Yep.
you have this view across the board. So what would you say is something that most like sales orgs that come to you guys, what are they getting wrong, right? Or what is one thing where you wish you could be like, man, if you all just did this, you'd be so much happier and so much better, right? Like,
Interesting. What are they getting wrong? I think that it's just I think a lot of people are struggling with kind of the transition, and I think this is also companies that are more established and have been around for a while. They're struggling with that transition from like the predictable revenue model towards
mhm,
kind of this like new approach. I had a friend who was working at like a very sizable company with like a BDR team of like 50 people. Um, and they were like, oh wow, they're just floored by what these new tools can do.
yeah,
But trying to figure out like, okay, practically what does this mean for us? And obviously the answer is not lay off the entire team and then and then build it from scratch. I think we're seeing a handful of teams that are kind of in that position where they're not getting the conversion rates that they used to. It doesn't make sense to just keep hiring because their CACs, yeah, I mean the CAC is going way up, and so that I think those teams I think are struggling a good amount, and for them in particular, I think the play is honestly more on like the RevOps side of things, where you have kind of one person owning these new tools, and their job is just to make sure that like the BDR team and the AEs are getting the most return on their time, and so it really gets into that kind of like a living account tiering model. Where you are kind of feeding in and having like a very tidy CRM, or just like outreach or whatever, like sales off whatever tools they're using, where it's like this week we have very high conviction that like these 20 companies are high intent. Like these are the companies, like do whatever it takes to get in front of them. And so I think a lot of teams are struggling with that. Especially kind of the more established teams kind of trying to shift away from the this like incumbent strategy. Yeah, I would say that.
I concur with that. I think I see it in two ways. So one thing like very specific to Glen Coco that I realized is a lot of people actually have kind of like a mediocre to vague conceptualization of what their ICP is, right?
Yep.
And Glen Coco as a product, since it's like pay per performance, we force someone to think about like, hey man, who would you pay $1,000 to meet with, right? Like,
yep.
And even if that doesn't become a deal, and that forces people to kind of back into like, well, okay, I started off by saying my ICP is like everyone who does sales, but now I need to get like a little real in terms of where am I actually going to see that ROI. So I found that it's actually surprising to me, and this is like both from like the startup to the enterprise level of people are just like, it's like this title, right? Like that's what I see.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of indicative of like a lack of fleshing out of the context data necessary and the intent data necessary to kind of hone in on who are you actually going to succeed with, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of one. And then the other thing that I've seen is, and this is more about like, when people are thinking about channels, something that I see all the time is people are like, oh, like, we tried calling, but it just didn't work. And I'm like, what do you mean by tried calling? Right? Like, and usually it's like, oh, we had this one guy, he was doing like 50 calls, or like, oh yeah, we had these guys in the Philippines and they were doing like 10 calls a day, or like, 100 calls a day, but we just gave them a list of numbers, like office numbers. They were just calling front desk all day. Right. And these are just like bad implementations of like a valid channel. And so like, and then when someone does that and then they write off the entire channel, I think then it becomes harder to be like, okay, guys, I need to sell you on calling as a channel and then tell you how to do it. Like, and that's something I see.
I mean, those are two really good ones. Yeah. I think like interestingly, the ICP stuff is kind of fascinating. Like for us, it's kind of this double-edged sword if you have, and you guys are in a similar position where like, if your TAM is colossal, on the one hand, it's like, this is awesome because we're like never going to run out of like companies to target that could theoretically be a fit for our product. On the flip side, it's like, you never are forced to be super specific about, who it is that you're targeting, and like be very thoughtful also about like how you're getting in front of them, where the risk of kind of burning through your TAM is substantially higher.
Yeah. And I feel like it's also anxiety inducing, right? Like just the feeling of trying to drink the sea all at once. You're like, oh, I'm going to pitch to everybody. And it's like, really, dude, you like, how are you going to even come up with one pitch, right? Like that's going to appeal to like Cisco and unknown startup, right? Like how are you doing this, right? And that's just not possible. Last thing I kind of wanted to touch upon, because we're coming up on like our last 15 minutes here, is where do you see teams having to spend the most resources today, right? Like for sales, I'm talking about sales teams. Like where do you think people are under investing and they should invest sort of more time in, and more sort of intent with, right? Building out.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, like a hot take is I think, BDR teams are a little bit bloated in general, like on average. And so I think that may be a bit of a misallocation of resources. Where like I think there's an argument to be made that like the BDR function is now just straight boiler room cold calling. And not everyone wants to do that. Like it's not an easy job to do. But I think like generally, like how are you structuring the BDR team? Who's responsible for what? I think is people are spending just so much money doing that.
Yeah.
I think where people are under investing is in kind of just like scraping this data and kind of doing this account scoring, knowing kind of like all these trigger events, using like the best possible LLMs. Like we are spending, like both on like our internal LLMs and then like elsewhere, like use it through Clay, like a very sizable amount of money every month.
Mhm.
But I think it's way more worth it to, have, the best in class, data and kind of like tool set versus having like two more BDRs.
Right.
What do you think?
Um, uh, I think you're right. So like part of it is like just the data practice again, like volume is a proxy for like lack of visibility. Like volume is a proxy for intent. Like if you don't have visibility and intent, you're forced to like just try to touch as many people as possible. And I think like that's also why like BDR teams get bloated. So you fall back on that predictable revenue model that you were talking about. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I just need to add processors, add people, and they're going to keep selling for me, right? I think the other thing that kind of people need to invest more into is you mentioned cold calling as a channel, and this is in no way, shape, or form like a plug for Glen Coco, but other channels are getting more saturated, right? Like
Yeah.
even like I was just looking at something today, like we're between 2010 to 2019, right? Like or rather 2010 to 2023 to now, right? Like reply rates have dropped by like 60%, right?
Wow.
Emails. So it used to be like in 2010 to 2019, 10 to 15% reply rates were like kind of that's like predictable revenue sort of expected numbers, and now you're at 2 to 3% reply rates, right?
Yeah.
Is the average. So it's channels are getting saturated. There's more messaging happening now than ever before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the barrier to write content, the barrier to write copious amounts of content is the lowest it's ever been because of new technology, right? And so I think a lot of people need to take a step because sales is also this thing you're doing it every day, so it's easy to get blinkered, but people need to take a step back and really invest in being like, okay, how do I maximize my successful at bats, right? And which channels do I use to maximize my successful at bats? The hottest take I'm going to tell you, like that, and this is mine, and it's probably the most controversial one. I think for most B2B, like advertising is like not great. Like I don't think advertising is like an excellent channel for B2B. Like and especially now with like with the chat GPT image generation, et cetera. Again, the barrier to create ad copy and ad content has dropped precipitously. So that's only just going to blow up more content. So to me, it's like, okay, you really want to like sales teams need to invest their time in being like going back and be like, we don't need to do everything, right? Let's find the things that work for us and let's just focus in on those, because you cannot do every channel unless you're like a massive enterprise org. So if you're like a scrappy sales team and you're like a scrappy team of 8, like Blanco, we're 8 people, so I can't do everything. So I need to pick the things that have the most ROI and just focus in on those and not FOMO on a channel, right? And that's kind of the thing that I think people need to spend more time on. Otherwise, you'll just keep doing something. You'll be busy and you'll just be less successful. And unless you take that step back, you won't know why, right? You'll default to being like, I need to hire more salespeople, right? And it's just like it's a vicious loop to get stuck into. And I think like that's where people mess up a lot.
It's a good take. Yeah, that makes sense. To your point about the saturation, I think it's interesting how it's kind of things are going full circle in some ways where, you think back like 40 years, like, Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross, or whatever. Like, it was basically like hammer the phones and like pull up at people's doors. And I
Yeah.
think it's kind of interesting how, we're leaning pretty heavily into like conferences, dinners, events, like, because there's just no, like, you're guaranteed that you're going to get in front of the person and you're going to have their attention if you're like at their booth and in their face. And so, anyway, it is interesting kind of thinking through, with all these channels, with kind of the low barrier to entry per channel and super low conversion rates, kind of like, where do you get that leverage? And I think, to your point, like, zero in on one and get really good at it, and then also think through, like, eyeballs yeah, it's interesting.
And I think hand in hand, it's not just like channels are getting saturated. I feel like with an expansion of like AI generated copy, AI generated messaging, we as consumers are getting subconsciously more suspicious, right?
Yeah,
And I sense this. I sense this in myself where I'm like, this is written by a person, right? Like I feel myself thinking that when I get emails, and it's because it's like I don't want to be sold to like just by a robot end to end, right?
totally.
And I
Yeah,
think most people don't, right? And like the thing that lets like that messaging stick is still right now there's this duplicity of like, oh, it might have been sent by a real person. But if I feel about email as a channel, if I suddenly wake up tomorrow and I'm like, yeah, man, I'm fairly certain most emails I get from people I don't know are like AI.
yeah.
I'm probably going to disregard email as a channel than like be like, oh, it's great now. I get all these emails and like
Yeah. I think what's interesting though is, this is another advantage of targeting go-to-market teams, because, like, if let's say I'm like at the gym, like, first of all, I think like email, I think I'm bullish on email in general. Like, I think people are just like, they're creatures of habit. And if you look at people at the gym or like on the subway, like, they're just it's like a very idle task that people just kind of default to, is just like scrolling on their phone through their like email, and like,
Mhm.
the inbox zero types of people. Um, but I think like what's compelling about selling these go-to-market teams is like, even if they know it's like AI generated, I think a lot of people are kind of flirting with and testing, how do you structure these prompts, get the right data, and how does it kind of feed into like compelling copy, um, and they realize like it's actually way harder than expected. And so I hope, like, at least for our ICP, that even if we are sending them emails, if they're really good at, even if they're like, okay, this is like AI generated, they're at least like, all right, how did you do that? And maybe they're curious, but
Yeah.
maybe not. Yeah,
Yeah. Like, I don't think email is ever going to go away, right? Like, I'm not the kind of guy that's like, oh, so and so is dead. Like, I feel like that's the most like overplayed like LinkedIn shock
totally.
factor content that gets put out. It's like, oh, this
Yeah,
is dead. It's like, no, nothing's
yeah.
dead, man. Like, it's not enough anymore. Like,
Yeah, I
that's
agree.
kind of my thing, right? Like, it's not enough, and at some point, right? Like, people like right now, I think cold calling is having a renaissance because of this, but just you flash forward, like you flash back to like Glengarry, Glenn Ross, like cold calling was the menace, and then it was like, oh, robo calling, and everyone was like, I'm not picking up a number I receive a call from that I don't recognize, right? And a lot of people are still in that mode, but
Yeah,
then so it kind of flips and flops. So just kind of
yeah,
figuring out which channels work is, and just staying on top of that and doing a sanity check every once in a while is what helps.
yeah.
Um,
100%. Yeah.
last 5 minutes here. Changing gears again. So one thing I'd love to do on this podcast, especially because I like to talk to salespeople, something that I think salespeople do better than anyone else is it's like tell stories of their sales successes. And it's actually the one thing we use at Glen Coco. By the way, this is like kind of giving you a peek behind the hood, but
Yeah.
we get so many people signing up. So like, how do we identify good sales talent? We've realized it's a pretty good predictor is if they can tell a good story about a time they've closed a deal. And it's really hard to fake and make
Mm.
up on the fly. So we find that's like a really good proxy. And so that being said, would love to know what is like in your career, what is a deal that you have teed up or closed or facilitated that you are most proud of? And tell me
It's a
that
good
story.
question. Uh, It's a good question. I mean, I think the like really early days of joining a company, like I think what I loved about Numeric is coming in and you have something, you have like 20 happy customers, you know that there's something there, and it's like how do you get eyeballs on this, and everything feels monumental. And so I think like one of those like the first big logos that we brought in is probably the one I kind of where my head is. Yeah, I mean, like Numeric, we brought on Plaid, um, which was a pretty big deal. And
That's
the
awesome.
way that we did it was just like sheer like hustle. Like we just had, like we kind of just put together this like map of like, all right, here are all the people on the team, and then here are their like first degree and second degree connections to our team. And then it was literally like trying to get, like engineers, like, all right, how well do you know this person? To then make an intro to this person who kind of knows this person and kind of putting it all together. And so, um, yeah, I just think that like those in particular feel huge because it's moving the needle from an ARR standpoint. It's moving the needle, like you now have whatever 10% more
Yeah.
logos than you did yesterday. And so that was fun. Where it's just like, how do we? Yeah, let's just find a way to get in front of these people.
And that's so exciting. First of all, that's unbelievable. That's an amazing story. And it's also, I think what you're talking about is like the prototype of like ABM and the prototype of like it is the progenitor like intent data and intent based sales, right?
Yeah,
Like it's like, hey, let's figure out like who do we know at this account? Like how do we make them realize that what we have is relevant to them and like kind of generate sort of this Bader Meinhof effect of just,
yeah,
hey, I'm caring about these guys everywhere. And like, it's hard to engineer that stuff. And it is kind of it's magic, honestly. Like that's how I think about it. Like,
yeah.
not to wax too poetic about sales, but it's awesome. It's like I use a bunch of words and I make you interested and you give me money, and that's how's that not magic? you
That's
know?
pretty cool. That's a good point.
Yeah.
What about you? What was your
Ooh.
what's yours?
So for me, it was my previous company. I was the CEO of this company called back then it was called Try My UI. Then we rebranded to call it Trimata, and like we kind of snaked this deal from this other like the big player in the space was usertesting.com.
Oh yeah.
And there was a company that was doing like it was when Web3 and crypto was kind of blowing up. So these guys, they were doing um, uh, a thing called like D apps, so like decentralized applications. So the way
Mm-hmm.
you mined their token was you built apps on their decentralized protocol, and they rewarded the best apps with their like crypto token, right? Whatever,
Mm.
stacks or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was called block stacks. So yeah, with stacks tokens, and the way they kind of had to where we recognized an opportunity is we were smaller than user testing, obviously, and we were willing to work with these guys. And they were like, hey, we don't know how to judge. We were coming up with judging criteria of which apps are good because we only want to reward good functional apps with this thing. So we were like, oh, we can user test like on a weekly cadence. We can user test all of the apps on your marketplace. And they were like, yeah, but we need some kind of rubric. So I actually like worked and built out like this survey model called the Adoption Likelihood Factors Questionnaire, and I like tested
Mm.
it and even patented it. And then
Really? Wow.
I did this in like under a week. It's crazy. Like it was insane. And then that let us win the deal. And the deal, it gets crazier. We got paid in part cash and then part crypto. So he was like, look, we can either pay you, 50K cash, or we could do 80K a year, like, 40 cash, 40 crypto. And I was like, sure, I'll take the 40 cash, 40 crypto, fully expecting the crypto to like not happen. And then
Yeah.
one day I suddenly see like this token that was, given to me at 30 cents a token is suddenly at like $2 a token. And I'm like, what's happening? And it turned out to be like being traded somewhere in South Korea for some
You're
reason.
kidding.
And there was like a bump. So we just sold it and we made like 300 grand just on
That's
the token.
amazing.
So that's like
That's sweet.
this is the craziest sales story.
Wow.
Well, that's why we do this, man. Like, the wins feel good, I feel,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And last question I have for you here, because I know we're coming up on time, is broad scale for the people watching this are probably in your ICP or related to your ICP. What would you say is the strongest possible case you can make for Starbridge?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think like, outbound is getting so hard. It's saturated. Intent signals are kind of like the only way to get in front of the right people at the right time. Um, if you are selling to SLED, we are like the best option. We get proprietary data that you can actually act on with, LLMs that are fine tuned to generate like very crisp, highly effective messaging. You can score accounts easily, and our customers are seeing like 3 to 5 times the lead volume that they were getting before, very quickly. And so I think, yeah, I'm very bullish about this kind of new go-to-market motion, and it feels like Starbridge is kind of at the forefront of that.
Hell yeah, it's the future of sales, man. And thanks so much for taking the time to hop on this call with me and hop on this episode of the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you. And for everyone watching, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Closer to Closers. Recordings of this and clips of this will be shared on my profile, so please check them out. And once again, Henry, thank you so much. Have a nice day, and you go Glen Coco.
Nice. All right, thanks, Rhett.
See ya.
See ya.